Great. Ryan, I don't know if I told you, this is my first JUMPinar in 2 or 3 months after I took some time off after graduating, and Angie and my other boss Ken filled in. So it's great to be back. I'm glad to have a great topic for my first one back.
It's good to have you back.
Hopefully, I'm still in practice. Apologies for any stuttering.
We'll work through it together, I'm sure.
All right, and welcome everybody. I see a bunch of people have already joined in. Thank you so much for registering and showing up on time. We'll give it another minute or two just to let others join in on the call, find the link and such, and then we'll start in about a minute or two. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome everybody to tonight's JUMPinar. This is the my first JUMPinar back in at least 2 months, I think. So it's great to be back at it and talking more real estate development with everybody here tonight. I hope the JUMPinar sessions over the last couple months were good with Angie on Jumpstart Loans 101, and we had Ken on for Every Building Has a Story, and a couple other topics. So I hope those were all great. And like I said, it's good to be back and joined with a great speaker tonight. Tonight we're covering construction contingency, which is something that Jumpstarters in particular are definitely aware of. Considering it's part of our pro forma and loan program construction budget, and also we teach it in our training program as well. So you might be familiar with it from there, but if you're totally new and coming into this looking to learn what construction contingency is, hopefully we'll cover that tonight. And if this is your first or if this is your first JUMPinar, these are like bi-monthly series that we hold, or it's a bi-monthly series that we hold here on Zoom webinar, and it's basically an open forum and a conversational interview between me and a guest and an expert in a particular part of the real estate world. So tonight's construction, next week is going to be developing with the community in mind. So neighborhood relations and how to fit your development into community. So yeah, we cover all sorts of stuff, and it's great to be here with Ryan tonight. So I'm gonna let Ryan introduce himself, but he is very briefly, he's a construction, or he works with a construction management company called Guardhouse Management, and he is a expert in contingency in particular, and helping new or not even new, but maybe even experienced developers make decisions about their budgets and contingency. So I'll let him say hi, and then we'll kick off the session with our discussion here tonight. Thanks for joining us, Ryan. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thank you for having me. Excited to be a part of it.
Of course. So why don't we start, and you just tell me, what you do with Guardhouse and what your organization does, and then, if there's any tidbits about you have like personally in the real estate world, like if you've ever been a developer yourself, I'd certainly like to hear about stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah. So my business partner and I started Guardhouse right around 2 years ago, middle of when COVID was starting to calm down, if you can say that it did.
Mhm.
Um, and we both have backgrounds working for general contractors. I worked for electrical contractors on projects that ranged from single family home builds all the way up to $180 million commercial campuses. So a little bit of experience kind of all across the board.
Nice.
And we found that what was missing on the owner side or on the developer side was getting someone like us involved a little earlier on in the project to help avoid some of the problems and the headaches later on. So we started Guardhouse with the mission of building a partnership approach, getting involved early with architect, engineer, owner, the entire team, and making sure that that process ran a little bit smoother and avoided some of those, the finger pointing conversations later on don't need to happen if you plan for it ahead of time. So that's kind of the background on the company. I focus a little bit more on pre-construction budgeting and what I would call due diligence assistance. And then other branches of the company are through construction management, managing the actual contractors on site all the way to the completion of the project and the turnover. And the one delineation I'll make, because it's a question we get along a lot of times, is we don't actually build. I won't hire anybody. We don't pull permits. We're not a contractor. We're the owner's resource in making sure that everything that they do, every step that they take, and every step that the contractors take are in their best interest and for the betterment of the project.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, that's a great background on what you guys do. And like you said, it sounds like you have a broad width of experience. So I'm sure there's overlap and also a lot of distinction between larger and smaller projects. So tonight we'll be talking more like on the scale of single family to maybe a triplex or small mixed use rehab, something that Jumpstart would fund, or the sort of project we teach people how to rehab. Tell me a little bit about this experience you guys have managing or helping manage with those sorts of projects. I'm sure like an architect, an engineer, and everything isn't always involved. So I'm sure there's like a capacity, right, where people are required to have someone like you help out. So do you guys work in that scale a lot?
Yeah. We like to say that there's nothing too big and nothing too small. I think we probably get tripped up often with some things that are too big for us to take on. But as far as too small goes, I mean, we're working with clients every day that are, one I met with yesterday is doing 2 duplexes down in North Philly. There was another developer we worked with that we helped him manage the construction of over 100 properties last year alone. So we've kind of worked our way into the single family duplex and triplex market. Wasn't where I expected to end up, but it seems to be an area of high demand for, like I said, that gap between proper planning and making sure that you have a plan going forward, and the execution through the construction phase. So we've taken on projects for single family duplexes. I would say where we limit out is if somebody's doing a kitchen renovation, we might be able to give them a little bit of advice, but it usually is not large enough to give us a call and have us help out.
Yeah, so there is and that's a distinction we make with our loan program too. Like, we're not just going to fund a single room rehab or turnkey project. We want to see that there's some like actual improvement being made to the entire property. Yep. And it's projects like that where you really need to consider contingency, right? Before we move on, I got my next question lined up, but before I say that, we are going to have a question and answer session at the end here tonight. So everybody who's listening, just remember, if you have any questions, type them into the Q&A function here on Zoom, and we'll get to them around 7:45 or maybe earlier if we wrap up before then. But yeah, feel free to type those away as we go, or save them till the end, whatever works. But yeah, back to what we were talking about. So construction contingency has to do with contingency, which means emergencies, right? Like sort of unexpected, oh shit moments, really. So why don't you kind of start by telling us what complexities could arise during a rehab project, and then we'll talk about how to solve them. So, in your standard, I know that's a huge question, but so like, why don't we, for people who might have never completed a project and don't know about that, Pandora's box of problems that could arise, what are some, that you can introduce people to the concept of a contingency cost?
Yeah. So I like to break kind of the contingency or the unforeseen items into 2 separate groups. The group that, a company like ours can assist with in due diligence, items that you might not pick up on early on, but people with a trained eye might be able to notice that, you know, there's sagging or cracking in foundation wall. If you're not planning on replacing all the plumbing, but understanding that the likelihood of the plumbing being destroyed out in the street or somewhere down in the basement where you're not paying attention, that group of emergencies or contingencies are often avoidable if you pick them up on a front end and get an inspection done either through certified home inspector or bringing someone like us in for what we call a due diligence assistance when you're buying the property or when you're ready to get started. The second group of contingency is the true unforeseen. There's no way we could have seen it. I had no idea this was going to happen. And that really depends on the type of the project and what you're doing in the scale of the project. But they're everywhere. I mean, I've worked on enough construction projects to know that none of them have run start to finish, even on ground up in the middle of a meadow. Nothing runs perfectly when you go through construction. So we like to advise clients to plan on contingency based on their level of understanding of what is there, what you could run into, and the type of construction that you're doing kind of changes the number of what you would carry.
Yes. So it's kind of important for people to make a distinction up front of like, oh, there's a baseline of things you need to check for, right? Like a contingency cost can't be something that you simply is occurring because you didn't look in an area of the house, right?
Right.
So
I mean,
unexplainable things, chance of it.
We typically, you know, we've gotten involved at every stage of a project with different clients, and we find that a lot of times if we're in the middle of construction or they already have permits and financing approved and all those things, the items that get tagged against contingency, there's a chance they could have gotten picked up during an initial inspection. No one's perfect. No one picks up everything. But if you walk into the basement and there's 4 floor joists that are completely rotted out and won't support any weight, the likelihood of you needing to replace that and picking it up earlier on is pretty high.
Right. So that's more so a bad investment decision than a contingency.
The truer contingencies, especially with properties that we've run into down in Philadelphia, you know, you have break-ins, you have squatter problems, you have some structural things that are hard to identify when you're first opening up the building. For instance, the walls are framed in and insulated in drywall and it looks perfect. And you start pulling it back and realize that there's a big vertical crack running down the side of the wall, or there's been water damage for years because the neighboring property was pulled down and there's a parge coat that has been failing from the exterior they can't really see. You know, that kind of stuff is what contingency is really for. It's for the no one could have seen it, we couldn't have planned for it. You know, and then the other side of that is things like, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but things like material escalation, or, you know, what's been happening over the last couple of years with the price of everything from oil to contractors to materials, really, really tough to plan for, you know, depending on the time frame of your project. And we're working with a developer right now who started a project in January of last year, and we're going on our second year of it. And just the cost of drywall has gone up 43% for a sheet of drywall in that amount of time. And at a scale like that, it makes a real big difference on your overall budget.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, we'll certainly get into material costs and sort of things that aren't necessarily like it's more of an environmental factor, right? Not right. Project itself. Could you give me some examples of some common, you know, things that do occur outside of like, you know, a lightning strike hitting the house and starting a fire? You know, what do you typically see people running into that situation where they're like, no way I could have ever planned for this. This is just happening.
Yeah. I mean, structural is a big one. If you get past the point where you start interior framing, you've usually put most of your issues behind, as long as you've taken a good look around and really identified everything. Right. And some of those items really don't show up until later in the project. And sadly, we've seen clients that it didn't show up until they were done, and a year later came by and the walls sagging because they have settlement in the front of the property.
Right. So, and could you like go more in depth on what you mean by structural? Like what sorts of problems would that capture?
Yeah. So foundation strength. A lot of these older properties in Philadelphia are built with stone stack foundations that have been parge coated 15 times over the years, and they're hiding kind of all the sins that are happening behind that. The city is also famously built on a lot of soft ground and
Right.
sandy areas with a lot of water penetrating into the basements that really kind of undermine those foundations. And any settlement in the foundation and what that house is built on is going to, get more drastic as it goes further up.
And and
Um,
and for people who don't know, like structural issues like that, they have a much bigger implication on like your ability to even complete the project, right?
yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So depending on the severity of it, whether it's foundations or joist systems or things like that, if it's one or two joists that you need to replace, a small section of foundation that you need to shore up, it's usually not the end of the world. It's just a little bit of time that you have to spend up front knowing it. But you get into larger foundation repairs where there's a big sag that requires underpinning or a large section of joists that need to be replaced. You might have planned on hiring just an architect for the project, but now you have to bring in a structural engineer to give you a design for making those repairs, fill out a special inspection through the city. And we've been in the middle of construction on projects where we just got brought in, and we're getting brought in because there's a make safe violation that gets posted on the front door
right.
for something that to the untrained eye you don't see as an issue, but the city's starting to pick up on it, and they're making an emphasis on how important it is for the structure of the property.
Yeah. So all these things we're mentioning sound very expensive. So
Yeah.
maybe let's get to the meat of the problem here, and why don't we talk about the budget, the contingency budget. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean for a developer? We know what contingency costs are. Now, is the budget something on top? Is it something you work into each line item? Is it a percentage? How do we calculate that?
So that depends on where you're at in the
Mhm.
it depends on where you're at in the process.
Right.
It depends on the type of property you're working on and what you know or who you've brought in to take a look at it.
Mhm.
So
Right.
on the commercial or larger project side, if you have a design team, a structural engineer that's done a review, you hired a certified inspector to do an inspection, you brought in a company like us to do due diligence. Once you get through all that stuff and you kind of have a good understanding, it's going to inflate your base budget because you have a lot more of those line items covered. But it
Mhm.
means that your percentage of what you have to set aside for contingency is usually a little bit lower. And we usually treat that on a percentage basis just as the whole job.
Right.
Um, when you don't have that stuff on the front end and you haven't done the planning and the investigative work, and you're just going in with a budget and you're not really sure where to apply the contingency, if you want to go with a percentage method or a dollar value method, you usually assign it to items like structural, roofing, even windows or window preparation, all of those items that you should truly see. And the way that we usually break this down is by the time, like I said, by the time you get to framing or rough in for all of your mechanical or plumbing, electric, and mechanical systems, by that point, you should have investigated and found everything that you're going to find. And whatever's left over in your contingency shouldn't have to be spent for anything other than the true occasional, oh, we didn't realize that this wall was going to conflict here and we have to slide something over.
So it's almost like within the contingency budget, there's other budgets, right? So
Yep.
it's like a certain portion of that contingency is going to be for this potential issue, this
Right.
potential issue, and then it sounds like there's a kind of carte blanche where it's just like a part of it is just, hey, this is left over for those chance events, right?
Yep. Yeah, I would say probably somewhere around 75 to 80% of that contingency usually gets taken up prior to or during interior framing. And then the remaining, 20 to 25% is what's picked up in finishes.
Right. And so another, this is kind of where I want to talk more about something you mentioned during our prep session was that like contingency budgets shouldn't be accommodating for a more expensive rehab, right? It's not that like halfway through the project you're thinking, oh, no, I haven't had any bad problems so far, so I can, pay for this extra expensive fixture, like electrical fixtures or something.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
like that's not what we're talking here, right? It's not like just because you don't spend it halfway through means, oh, I now have a bigger construction budget.
Right. Yeah, and we do get this question a lot, or we get towards the end of a project, and a lot of owners or developers will start wanting to pick away at the contingency budget to, like you said, buy more expensive tile or light fixtures or those kind of things. Um, and we try and work with people on a more holistic or long-term view of what a construction budget and what financing is going to do for that property. Mm-hmm. Where, usually the idea is to hold on to the property to rent it out or to turn around and sell it. And although you could add nicer tile or nicer light fixtures or whatever those things and borrow those line items from the bank, it's money that you have to pay back. You're taking a larger loan and just racking up what I would call the proverbial credit card. Right. Contingency should be planned for just a, break glass in case of emergency type line item. Those finishes and those level of finishes and fixtures and items like that should be planned on really early on in the project, knowing that this is the product that you want to turn over. For two reasons. One, if you accurately budget for the level of finishes that you're going to have, you'll never have to touch that contingency. You'll know what the maximum value you're going to spend on the project is, and it helps you with financing and building pro forma and everything down the line. Mm-hmm. But the other reason of it is it paints a picture in your head for marketing and who you're going to rent this place to or who you're going to sell it to. And in the event that something happens later on in the project, if you spent all of your contingency on nicer tile and nicer appliances and all these things, and right before you're about to close the loan, a flood happens, someone breaks into the property, you get a violation for, an exterior facade problem that you didn't see, or whatever it is. There are things that occur in that last 25%. And you never want to be ending up, dry and out of financing and ended up paying for those things out of pocket.
And a reminder for people, you said you're only paying back with the money that you lent, or in most lending situations, obviously everything's a little bit different, but with Jumpstart loans, you give us your construction budget and there's that mandatory 15% contingency on top. And if you don't use any of that, that's great. That's less interest that's accruing and less principal that you have to pay back. So I appreciate you bringing up that point. But so let's talk about that. That's if you're using a lender and kind of you're like, it's like an allowance, right? It's like, oh, you're allowed to have this much on top. Right. But what about if you're not using a lender or using maybe some, friends and family money or a self-financed project? So how do you make that decision? Because there's sort of a point where you could be like, oh, I just have extra money in my bank account, so that's my contingency budget. But that's also a no-go, right? Because
I always recommend people that take the same approach that you had when we started the job, when you first looked at the property. Mm-hmm. I have never met a developer or an owner walk into my office and say, I want to spend as much money as humanly possible on this building.
Right.
I have a strict budget and I need to stay underneath that budget. And if I go above this number, it doesn't work. The deal doesn't work. The rent doesn't cover it. Whatever that long-term plan or short-term plan is, you should have a plan and should have a number in mind of what you're planning on spending on that project. So if you have that viewpoint early on of, I need to design this, I need to plan this to fit inside of this budget, you should carry that mindset all the way through to now not only fit inside of that budget with that contingency that you built in, but try and beat that number and be even lower. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you have to go through and pick cheaper finishes as you go through, but we, on the owner's representation or construction management side, we like to treat contingency as a challenge. Mm-hmm. Because if I get to the end of a job and like you said, if with Jumpstart loans, if there's a 15% contingency, by the time we get done with framing and there's 10% or there's 50% of that 10% or 15%, numbers all over the place, if there's half of that contingency budget left for the property, my goal is to try and use as little of that as possible. And if we get to the end of the job and we used none of that, we did our job. Yeah. And that would be what I call the successful project. If we get to the end and we burn through all the contingency, I actually reevaluate the job as a whole, figure out where that money went, what didn't we plan for correctly, and how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? Because like I said, the performer, or the long-term plan or the short-term plan of flipping a property is all based on that preliminary number that you put together, and the contingency there is just a safety blanket to make sure that you don't have to go to mom, dad, cousin, or anybody else to ask for another $5,000.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this, but it's like it could be compared to like betting, right? Like you're kind of gambling on I'm gonna bet this much percent up front, and we'll
Mhm.
see how the deal works out, and if it's more or less, you're making or losing money. So,
Yep.
yeah, it's important to keep your your eyes focused on the project and the investment itself. So.
Yeah. Yep.
So now I asked you about this a little bit earlier, or we just touched on it earlier, but I want to dive in more detail about increasing costs. So you mentioned like drywall, and I didn't ask. Are you based in Reading? Is that where you're Reading?
So I preliminarily work out of home up in the Pottstown area.
Yeah,
My business partner's out in Lancaster. We have somebody else that works in Reading,
cool.
and I would say a good 70 to 80% of our work is within the city limits of Philadelphia. So
Okay,
we
cool.
we travel all over, work all over, and kind of cover that rectangle, if you would.
Cool. So I'm sure you're then well aware that the rising costs in Philadelphia of not just housing but materials and the cost of materials. It's happening everywhere. Um,
Mhm.
that's something that also is it's in that gray area of, well, I can expect the price of things to slightly increase, with inflation over time and natural, the world we live in now, but you can't budget twice as much as you think you're going to need for items. So how do you use your contingency budget to manage an increase in material costs? Because that's a bit different than needing extra material to fix a mistake or some chance event. What tips do you have for us on that?
Yeah. So we usually handle that a couple different ways with clients, depending on if it's their only property, if they don't have another place to store materials. Um, you know, we do have a lot of groups that have multiple properties at once, but they're only working on one. So we'll use an ancillary property for temporary storage materials, buy as much as we can up front to lock in prices today.
Mm-hmm.
What I have said to everybody for the last 2 years is the number is not going down between now and when you finish that project.
Right.
At some point, lumber will come back down.
Right.
Tile may start to settle out. HVAC systems, I don't know. But we usually help to identify some of the specific items that we know are going to be a high risk factor for inflation and try and buy those things early on. If you're not able to do that, you can probably lock in that pricing with material suppliers to give them a 50% deposit and say, hold on to it, but lock in my pricing. You can assign it through a general contractor or another contractor where you sign an agreement with them that says, I'll lock in with you to lock in a rate at, X dollars per linear foot of trim or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it does often come down to having that contingency set off to the side and being able to plan for it. And it really comes down to the execution rate between the day that you sign the loan and you're ready to move forward and when you start building.
Yeah.
You're much more likely to run into those issues that if you sign the loan today, but it's February of next year before you actually pull a permit and start doing work, you're much more likely to see all of that inflation across the board. And there's really nothing you can do to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
So it's an execution rate, but it's also a couple different strategies that you can do to manage that cost and work around it so that it might still impact the contingency budget, but not to the level that it would have before.
Right. Right. And we talked about, the how it's not a good decision to increase the expense or accommodate for a more expensive rehab, right? And buy more expensive materials. What about if there's a situation where price material increases or, so maybe you use a certain portion of your contingency budget and you can't get that money back? Would you recommend people like lower the quality of the rehab? They say, oh, I can't afford the luxury, wood panel flooring. I need to get the, vinyl linoleum. So what's kind of that move? I guess it's kind of a more of an investment question than anything, but
Yeah. So part of that is what we typically get involved very early on with material selection or the finishes that you're going to put in.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned before, some of it's about what your long-term plan is. If it's marketed as luxury rentals,
Right.
if it's more on an affordable housing side, if it's a quick flip to try and sell the property to another investor, there's a lot of different strategies for how you market a property and what you put into it because of that. But the short answer is there is no a quick answer for what you do in this situation. It really depends on where you're at financially for the project, what your long-term goals are. And I don't, as a blanket statement, recommend that people lower the quality of their products.
Mm-hmm.
And I always have this term that I use, that the project is going to cost what it's going to cost. And the more you try and fight it, it just means that you're going to pay it later. So the example that we use is for LVT flooring. I always recommend anybody that has, they expect to rent to somebody that has pets, to use a minimum 20 mil wear thickness layer on top of the LVT. Mm-hmm. What's underneath it doesn't really matter that much, but that top wear layer is going to be the life cycle of your product and how long it's going to last. Mm-hmm. So if you spend $2,000 less today, because in the entire house you put 5 mil wear thickness in, but you have to replace the LVT in the entire house in 2 to 3 years rather than 10, you have to look at a life cycle cost and say, okay, if I want to rent this property for the next 10, 15, 20 years and then turn around and sell it, it means that it's actually going to cost me $10,000, $15,000 more than the $2,000 savings.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I like your answer. It's sort of like you shouldn't run into that problem, right? You should have a set, determined way that your product is going to look. And you got to do whatever it takes to make it reach that, right? So it's not like you're changing the end use as it goes.
Yeah, and for some products, for some installations, if you had a Shaw uncommon ground LVT and that's what you wanted, that's the color that you liked, and Shaw rose their prices 40 cents per square foot or whatever it is, half the time you can call around to different suppliers and get an alternate product that's the same quality and it looks the same, but you can get back to the original pricing. But what we're starting to see, especially over the last couple of years, is it's just a blanket raise across across all industries, where doesn't matter who's making the vinyl product, they're getting an inflation rate from the supplier that gives them the raw materials to make the product, and they have to pass that on, and everyone's kind of increasing at the same rate. So drywall is another example where if drywall goes up 40 cents, there's really nothing you can do to avoid that increase in 40 cents if you haven't already planned for it beforehand.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. So I got one or two more questions here, and then we'll move into the live listener questions. I see we've got a couple, but I sort of want to talk about, throughout the loan process, right? I mean, obviously people should have this in the back of their heads all the time, but there's a certain point where you really got to make that decision and say, okay, this is how much I'm putting for my contingency budget. Like, you need to make a determination, especially if you're in a lending situation, you're submitting a loan application, you need to have a determined amount. So before making that, we want to make an informed decision, and I guess a big part of that comes through what you see walking through the property, right? So you're going to notice the broken floor joist and or the water damage, but we're not all construction experts, and we especially if you're a first-time investor, you don't even know what to look for, no matter how hard you try. So what tips do you have for people who are new to this to engage and sort of learn and make sure they're being informed during that walkthrough and due diligence process? Do they call up a person like you, or they find an experienced friend or something? What do you suggest people do?
Well, I always suggest people call me, but that's the business side of things.
Right, I set you up for that one, right?
Yeah. So I always suggest people to call me. What we usually try to explain, especially to first-time investors or first-time developers, is you would never walk to a used car lot and buy a car without bringing your cousin or your friend or someone from your family that knows something about cars in order to make that purchase and make an educated purchase, knowing what you're getting into. And the same holds true with a property or with planning on construction, where if you don't have that friend, that contractor, that somebody that you trust, and someone you trust versus someone is two very different things, which we can have a whole separate JUMPinar about.
Yeah.
You really need someone in your corner that's not trying to give you the good news. They're trying to give you the realistic picture. So typically what we do during a due diligence assistance survey when we walk in with a client is to walk around and say, hey, I don't know everything. I'm still, even though referred to as an expert, I hope to still be learning every day for the rest of my career. But but I will know certain areas to look and certain things to point out. So as that relates to, because I think the first part of the question was contingency budget and how to plan and how much to set aside. The easiest way that we put this is 3% is the bare minimum that I've ever recommended anybody to carry in a contingency budget. And that is for large scale commercial projects that they've had an entire team of architects and engineers and everybody surround that project and plan for it, so that you know that there's very little that might come up. And because the scale of the job, that 3% should cover quite a lot.
Right. So like a new construction project where you kind of like, everything you're putting up is going to be on you.
Yeah. So, but even new construction, Philadelphia is a perfect example where there's a lot of projects that we do new construction between two properties, where you have that keystone lot that's empty between two row homes and you're filling in. Until you get a geotechnical survey to see how deep the neighbor's foundations are and whether you have to underpin them, until you know what the soil contaminants or rock levels are. There's a lot of things there that the money could spike very quickly.
Yeah.
So 3% is our bare minimum. And I think using 15% for the jumpstart is a good gauge for where you should be at your early stages of development, when there's a lot you still have to learn, there's a lot you still have to plan for. But I don't think the 15% should just be a blind number that you tack on walking in blind to a project, where I would probably still recommend carrying 15% even after you have someone like us look at it, or you have a contractor friend or whoever it is walk through the property and look at it, because through the process of development, you're going to learn what you or we or your contractor didn't look for, or the things that come up during a project that you couldn't have seen regardless of the inspection. So we do it on a sliding scale, and we say, what do you think that you know about this property on a scale of 1 to 10? I have never met anybody, and I am not a 10. I will not know 10 about your property. So I'm probably an 8. And you take that number and you add, or you however much is left over to 10, that's how much you're going to add to that 3 to 5% range. So if you feel like you're a 5 in your knowledge, you've done this a couple of times, but you still are learning through the ropes, or you have a little bit of experience, you take the 5 minus 10, 5% added to the original 3 to 5, somewhere in that 8 to 10 range is probably a comfortable contingency budget to carry.
Awesome. Yeah. And I love how much you're hammering down on that point of like, how much do you know? Because I especially with the Jumpstart loan, we get a loan application, and there might be like a good amount of information there, but sort of some things are left unchecked, and some line items might be a little confusing or misspelled or whatever. And it might seem ridiculous that we go back and forth and say, hey, what is this? How much is this going to cost? And how much is this, like did you think about this? We saw this violation. So we really like to hammer down on that point of due diligence, because that really can set you up to fail or succeed throughout the rest of the project, particularly with a contingency budget, right? It's like every investor dreads that day when they have to pull out of their own pocket, and they're like, oh man, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get this money back. And this is your safeguards against that, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, planning, like you said, planning is the 5 P's of construction that I learned when I was 6 years old and first started in the business is proper prior planning prevents poor performance. 6 P's.
Great. We got to add that acronym to the Jumpstart manual. That's good. And then I guess so. My last kind of question here before we move on to the questions from our attendees, and just a reminder to go ahead and type those in as you got them, everybody in the call. I wanted to talk about managing your budget throughout the rehab, right? So we've talked a lot about the budgets, and it's a percentage that you have on top. How would you suggest people like draw from that, right? So obviously we don't want people to encounter a problem in the first, very first stage of their construction timeline. like panic and take all the money out of their contingency budget, and then a couple weeks later when something comes down the line, they don't have much. Or in the reverse, not using it all throughout the project, really screwing up a couple things, and then having a bunch of money that for stuff you can't fix.
Mhm.
How should people kind of make those decisions in drawing it out of their budget, especially from a lender?
Yeah, so we typically suggest that you start a job with a real drilled down scope of work
Hmm.
written, so that if you're going to hire contractors direct, or you're going to piecemeal it where somebody's going to do the framing, someone's going to do demo, someone's going to do framing, someone's going to do interior framing, plumbing, etc. You have line items set up for each one of them individually, not just I think the job's 100,000 and then try and fit inside that box.
Right.
And then from a contingency perspective, if you take that percentage, that 15%, and make it 15% of each one of the individual line items, that's what you should feel comfortable spending on that line item. So if you have a framing contractor and he says, hey, there's a couple joists here and they're really bad and we have to replace them, it's an extra $800. As long as the 800 fits into the 15% of that line item, not of the whole budget, then it should be a comfortable spend, because you might not spend 15% on tile or whatever it is later on in the project. What we commonly run into on like you said, on both ends of the spectrum, is people get so worried about spending any of that contingency on the earlier stages of the project that they slow themselves down, leading to more problems, more delays, more likely that something goes wrong, more material escalation, all of those things. So you have to be relatively decisive of, okay, I have to spend this money, make peace with it. I'm not happy about it, but this is the decision that's going to keep the project moving forward.
Gotcha.
On
Yeah.
the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum are people that say, I have a problem, I'm just going to throw as much money at it as I can,
Mhm.
and make the assumption that tile and plumbing and all of those other things later on in the budget aren't going to be a problem. And
Mhm.
that's where you get into some really risky areas of, like you mentioned, if you spend all of your contingency before you get to framing and it's all gone,
Mhm.
everything after that is coming out of your pocket. So you really have to play that balance game of management to try and stay underneath the 15% as a whole, and you do it on a line item by line item basis. And a lot of it comes down to, um, like I said, the planning, making sure you understand what the total scope of the project is,
Yeah.
making sure that each one of your contractors understands what their role is, that you've clearly identified, hey, I know that these joists need to be replaced. I know that I want you to do perimeter framing all the way around. Don't just take a quote from somebody that says, I do framing $5,000, and
Mhm.
assume that you're going to get exactly what you want out of that project, because they're going to find a piece that they're not going to call framing, or it wasn't specifically shown on the drawings. And that's where the scope gaps, and that's the other part here that, again, we can take a JUMPinar to talk about, but
Yeah.
the scope gaps is where a lot of projects bleed money,
Mhm.
and that shouldn't be taken out of contingency. That's part of the planning phase. That's part of understanding what it is that framer needs to do entirely, so that when he walks away, it's the next guy in and we keep moving down the line. Or in the event of using a general contractor, again, if you get a 5-line quote that says, I'll fix the interior, I'll do some plumbing, I'll finish the job, $60,000, that's not something to build a project on. You need to clarify exactly what the expectation is, what's covered, what assumptions he made, and include all of that in his contract to make sure that you're protecting yourself as the owner against him coming to you every month and saying, oh, we didn't know that this wall needed to go here, so we need another $5,000.
Yeah.
And we run into that constantly. And it's not because contractors are bad people. It's not because they're trying to steal your money. I was one of those contractors. I understand it. And that's really the foundation of where our company came from, is getting those two groups on the same page and getting them to understand what the end goal is and what the expectation is throughout the entire line, so he can price it accurately and still be competitive without pricing above everybody else that's looking at the job, and still give you the product that you're expecting to have at the end.
Great. Yeah, awesome. I think that's a great place to end on, and that kind of summarizes a lot of what we talked about today. And again, just planning, 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 due diligence, and all that great stuff. Yeah, Ryan, I really appreciate you taking the time tonight to talk with us. We definitely covered all my notes. I could ask you plenty more questions, and I will take you up on that offer to join us again for another topic. And I forgot to mention, but Jesse Smith, who's another speaker we had on maybe 3 or 4 months ago, is the one who recommended us to have you join us, and maybe you could give us some names of other experts in your circle who could
Yeah,
share knowledge.
yeah,
We
absolutely.
really enjoyed having you on. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
So let's move over to the live questions here before we wrap up tonight. And feel free to type those in, listeners, as we go here. But the first one is pretty basic question. I think we definitely covered this, but Ryan, if you want to maybe restate the method of doing it, how do you calculate contingency? It sounded like a percentage that you put on top, and then divide that budget up between line items, and that's really the way to go, as opposed to just eyeballing it and being like, hey, maybe about 25 on top, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So contingency again is specifically outside of the normal budget. You try and gather as much information as you can, plan for as much as you can, talk to different contractors, bring in a group like us. We do estimates for projects just to get you in the right ballpark. And then once you have that preliminary budget of, I think this is going to cost me $150,000, that's when you say, okay, how much do I actually know about this job? How comfortable am I with that 150? And that's going to set the percentage that you would tag on top of it.
Great. Great. And our next question here comes from Darnetta, and you might understand what she means more than I, but she's asking, how are surcharges applied? Does she mean maybe surcharges on material or from your contractor? Or
I
is surcharge means it's after the fact, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but
Okay, well, maybe Darnetta, if you could follow up and just provide some more clarification, and we'll come back around to it. The next one here comes from Reedy, and they were wondering, are you using a per square footage estimate for your rehab and or flip? If so, what number and how often do you increase that number? So this seems like a more, creating construction budgets outside of contingency. Are you using, and this was on my list of questions to ask you too, are you using a price per foot, square foot approach, or would you strictly stick to line items?
it's my favorite question. And
Cool.
the answer is always no. No, 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 never.
Gotcha.
We do use specific price per square foot numbers to check at the end once we've put the budget together. But again, we did 100 single family or over 100 single family full gut renovations into 3-bed, 1-bath units that all looked around the same. They're around the same square footage. And I can tell you on the 100 or so that we did, we had projects that came in around $115 a square foot, all the way up to $185 to $190 a square foot. So square foot estimating should really only be used as the end, as a check number back to make sure that you're in the right ballpark. But it's a really, really risky bet on a project as a whole to say, well, it's an interior gut rehab, so I imagine it's going to be $150 a square foot.
Right.
Where you can use square foot estimating is on specific line items, for structural steel, flooring, drywall, those kind of things. You can access some databases or branch off of your experience and say, okay, well, I know LVT purchase and install is around $5 to $6 a square foot, and that's how you set that line item. But as a budget as a whole, never a good idea. Even for ground up projects, you could, and Jesse, as you mentioned, will tell you this, you can hire 10 different architects to draw the same building, and they will draw 10 separate buildings. They will look very different from each other. They're designed different. And that's just brand new. Imagine combining that with renovation work. Square foot numbers are they give me the chills to try and plan off of.
Great. Yeah, that's a great answer. It's exactly, how Jumpstart looks at it when we take loan applications. And I also think, like you said, it's important to recognize that it can be useful, when you're comparing previously completed projects with one another and talking about it from a post rehab angle, but definitely not would not advise.
Yeah.
Similarly, we've seen countless of seemingly on paper exactly the same projects, but when you go into the rehab and each inspection and what we're finding, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, great. So the next question here comes from Mara, and she was wondering what is the name of Ryan Prendergast's company and contact information. And she asked, "Are you a part of the Jumpstart program?" You're not, but you are now as a guest on our JUMPinar series. And she was wondering what are the 5 Ps again. So if you want to put your contact information out there, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can even or if I can send it out afterwards in an email if you want. That works. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to send it out an email, feel free to reach out, email, text, phone calls, whatever it is. We're pretty much always available.
All right. Sounds good.
The first question, Guardhouse Management Group. If you just search Guardhouse Management Group, we should be one of the only ones that pop up. If not, I got to work on my web optimization. And the 5 Ps or 6 Ps, because I struggle with counting sometimes. So it's proper prior planning prevents poor performance.
Great. Yeah, I love that. All right, thank you, Mara. And the next question here comes from Emerald, and they were wondering, can you discuss duplex conversions from single family, so a multi-unit conversion, and things we need to keep in mind? So again, Ryan, I think I prepared you for this, Ryan. You're a construction guy, so everybody's going to ask questions, no matter if they relate to contingency or not.
I enjoy this probably a little bit too much, but I'm glad that I found this as a career because this is probably what I would be doing even if I wasn't on the phone or on this call, was finding somebody to ask me questions. So duplex or multifamily conversions from single family homes are complicated for a slew of reasons. The first one being zoning, whether or not it's zoned to be an RM1 or any kind of multifamily type property. If it's not currently zoned, you need to get involved with the zoning attorney, an architect, and likely a civil engineering company to map out the building, submit those documents on your behalf, and try and get you approved for that conversion. That's the very first step before someone like me even looks at the job, is you have to get through all the legal rigmarole that allows you to actually build multifamily in the city. On the construction side of things, where you're going to see big differences from single family homes, and this becomes important with the design team that you pick and the contractors that you pick, that if somebody's done nothing but single family homes, they're not going to know to look for these items. So for instance, in the city of Philadelphia, I think anything larger than a duplex, and if it is a ground up duplex, requires sprinkler systems. Something that would never come up on single family homes unless you're building ground up, which I think they are required now. But you need sprinkler systems, which means you need a sprinkler contractor, engineer calcs and drawings. And you need to pay the city a tap fee for a separate connection from your domestic service out to the street. You have fire rating requirements and sound rating requirements between units, between floors, between walls. So there's a lot of pieces that go into multifamily that aren't traditionally included in single family. And that's where you really need to get a good group of design and construction professionals around you to make sure that you're checking all those boxes. Because if you get and we've run into this before, where if you submit the drawings that don't include those things, or it's not very clear or it's vague, even if they approve you based on the drawings and you build exactly what the drawings show, L&I has the opportunity to say, that's not the code. I don't care what the drawing says. You have to meet the code requirements for a property like that.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, great answer. Thank you, Ryan. And Emerald, stay tuned, because I think we'll have another JUMPinar in a few, I think maybe the second half of September. We're going to focus on multi-unit conversions. So we'll be talking about that exact kind of question, and hopefully you can join us then too. But the next question here comes from David, and he was wondering, say the project is awaiting government funding. How does contingency project budget change as you await funding, especially as the price of materials increase? Do you just estimate price as higher than usual? So that's a great question, especially when there's like David said, a huge gap between when you're being approved for a loan or finance and when construction begins. So what tips do you have for us?
So on the government funding side of things specifically, there's a lot of requirements depending on the government agency that you're working with that are going to lead you to use prevailing wage contractors or certified payroll. which is substantially more expensive than open market. So it's one of the things that you have to plan for right away, not part of contingency, but a drywall finisher for a rack P type project, for instance, is between his basic rate and the benefits that you have to pay on top of it is around $85 an hour, whereas open market is somewhere in the $25 to $30 an hour range. So vastly different projects when you go with government funding. But any type of funding where you're expecting to wait, I would say probably past 6 months, or like I said, that execution gap between when you submit the budget for approval and when you start construction is passing anywhere over 6 months. There are certain line items that you should look at and plan to either add additional contingency or add additional funding to those line items based on the volatility in the market. So the last 2 years up until about 3 months ago, lumber, drywall, HVAC systems, and plumbing were the 4 hot topics for everyone to put a little bit more money into, because month by month, when you go to a lumber yard, it just kept going up. So there's a couple different resources that you can look at online. There's projected futures that you can look at, but yeah, anything that extends that 6 or 8 months or anything past that, you really want to plan a little bit more on a line item basis. Or if you're not really sure where to go, you might want to expand what that contingency budget's going to be, or even some lenders will allow you to apply a separate contingency line item that says material escalation contingency, where you have your base contingency set at 10, 12, 15%, and you have another 4 or 5% for material inflation.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. We at Jumpstart would be very impressed if we got a loan application that had a contingency for material costs specifically. That'd be great. All right. So that's that question. Next comes from Tamika, and she was wondering, do you work with clients from start to finish? Are you more of just stopping in for a walkthrough, or are you there from, construction beginning to the end?
We are there for every step and any step that people need us to be involved in. Some people just want a lending hand and a second set of eyes to help them look at a project from a start, get them headed down the right path, handle the pre-construction, and send them on their way, and they're on to manage the rest of the project. We also work with what we call absentee owners, which is, I'm down in the Bahamas. Call me once a month and tell me how much money I have to send to each one of the contractors, and that's all I want to know about the job. So anything between those two, it really at any scale, other than direct on-site management every single day of a single family home, just because financially it wouldn't make sense, but we're there for any step of the way.
Okay, great. And just I'm going to try and speed through a couple questions here because we are running short on time. Mara was asking, what is your website? And it's just guardhousemanagement.com.
Should be, yes. It's been a while since I checked, but I think that's it.
Cool. Well, I just typed that in chat for you, Mara. The next one is from JB, and they were just asking what the average cost for a walkthrough from your company. So you can certainly, reach out to Ryan here on an individual basis. I'm sure he'd give you a more detailed estimate, but because again, every project is so different. But is there a general cost you can give people to expect in terms of like a single family duplex rehab walkthrough?
Yeah. So single family duplex, some of the what I would call simpler projects, it's probably around $200 to $300, depending on what it is that we're looking at, what kind of report that you want us to put together at the end of it, or if there's any further steps that we have to take where we make connections with architects or structural engineers that can help you out. You get into larger multifamily projects or commercial. I have spent 3 full days walking through one building, looking at every inch of it. So it's a vast range, but if you email me with a specific project or a question, I'd be happy to give you a price.
Awesome. Yeah. And Gene Smith, requested to have your contact info again. So I'll make sure to send that out tomorrow. And we have one question here that's really good, and I want to make sure I hit on this from Darren. He was wondering, I am about to purchase a lot in Southwest Philadelphia, and there's a current construction project next door. What can I expect as far as separate projects that are on adjoining lots and possible pitfalls? So that's something I've never really thought about, but I can imagine how that would, be a problem for a developer if there's 2 projects right next to each other. Is there a chance for contingencies to arise there?
Yeah. probably one of the first things that you want to do is introduce yourself to the neighbor. Make sure you get the name of the contractor, a copy of their insurance if they'll give it to you, just to make sure that if anything happens between the two properties, the earlier on you can get to know them and coordinate with them and say, okay, well, let's share the responsibility of building this wall. There's a lot of fire rated details for properties that have a party wall where the two meet, that sometimes is not not explicitly shown, that you have to kind of dive into, but there is a coordination effort that goes into that. And if you don't have a party next door that's willing to work with you, or you don't have the ability to work with them, yeah, it's one of those areas that I would definitely put some contingency money off to the side and come up with a good plan for how you solve working around that cube. And I don't have an answer for it right off the cuff, because again, every project's a little bit different, but you are going to have to plan for something for where those two projects meet, even if it's not an active construction site next door. If it's new construction, old construction, anytime that where your building is touching up against something else that was already built or is being built, there's termination details and a plan that needs to be put in there to make sure that you're not flooding their house, they're not flooding your house, and none falls down on the other.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Great answer. And that does it. I'm sorry if I missed any of those questions there, but we're getting carried away and gotta head out for the night. But thank you so much for joining us again, Ryan. I really appreciate you setting some time aside to educate our community here tonight about contingency, and hopefully we're all a little bit more informed and prepared to go on our next project and not run into any of those problems, hopefully by chance, but if we do, we'll know how to encounter them and make sure we're protected. So thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And I don't have the slideshow up, but I just wanted to let everybody know that next week we are having another JUMPinar with Anne Marie Doley on developing with the community in mind. So that's going to be talking about neighborhood relations and how to convince the near neighbors that your zoning approval is worth it. But so talking all sorts of things like that, which we haven't really covered in a JUMPinar, and I'm excited to touch on. And then the week or 2 weeks after that is going to be a multi-unit conversions JUMPinar, like I mentioned, with RJ Griffin. And I'll send out the flyer for that along with Ryan's contact information. And the links to our Zoom recording of this session, and eventually we'll have a podcast made once I edit the audio down into an audio only version. So look forward to that. I see a bunch more chat bubbles, and I bet it's people saying thank you. Yeah, Mara, Jihad, I'll both say thank you, and we appreciate it. And hopefully, Ryan, you'll hear from some jump starters, with questions about their projects coming up here. Okay.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody.